The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I should have been used to them by now. "You're just dead weight, Stephanie," my mother screamed from across our cramped kitchen in Beaumont, her face twisted with the kind of rage that had become as familiar as the peeling wallpaper behind her. I stood there, frozen, holding the college acceptance letter that had started this whole mess. The paper trembled in my hands, not from excitement anymore, but from the crushing realization that even my achievements meant nothing to her. 22 years of trying to earn her love, and this was what I got, another reminder that I was unwanted in my own home. I had walked into the kitchen with such hope, clutching that letter from the University of Texas like it was a golden ticket to a better life. The scholarship was full ride, everything I had worked for since high school, staying up late studying while she watched TV and complained about the electric bill. But the moment I tried to share my news, her eyes had gone cold, that familiar look of disgust washing over her features like I had just tracked mud across her clean floors. "College?" she had laughed, a bitter sound that made my stomach clench. "Who's going to pay for your books, your food, your gas? You think money grows on trees, you selfish little girl?" The unfairness of it all made my chest tight with suppressed anger and hurt. I had gotten a full scholarship. Full ride meant everything was covered, but she wouldn't even listen long enough to understand that. She never listened. Not really. Not when it came to me. My younger brother Patrick could do no wrong in her eyes, even when he dropped out of high school and spent his days playing video games in the basement. But me? I was the problem child, the burden, the mistake she never let me forget she had made. Standing there in that kitchen, I felt the familiar sting of tears threatening to spill, but I had learned long ago not to cry in front of her. "I got a scholarship, Mom," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum of our ancient refrigerator. "It means they pay for everything. I wouldn't need money from you." But even as I said it, I knew it wouldn't matter. This wasn't really about money, and we both knew it. This was about her fundamental belief that I didn't deserve good things, that somehow my very existence was a burden she had been forced to bear. The way she looked at me sometimes, like I was something unpleasant she had found stuck to the bottom of her shoe, made me wonder what I had done as a child to earn such hatred from the woman who was supposed to love me unconditionally. Her laugh was sharp and cruel, cutting through the air between us like a knife. "Oh, you think you're so smart, don't you? Miss Perfect with her perfect grades and her perfect plans." She stepped closer, and I could smell the stale cigarettes on her breath, see the lines of bitterness etched around her mouth. "Let me tell you something, Stephanie. You're just like your father, all big dreams and no sense of reality. You think you can just waltz out of here and leave me to deal with everything? Leave me with Patrick and all the bills and all the problems?" Her voice rose with each word, and I found myself backing toward the doorway, my body instinctively trying to escape even as my feet remained planted on the worn linoleum. The mention of my father sent a familiar pang through my chest. He had died when I was 15, and in the 7 years since, she had used his memory as a weapon against me more times than I could count. According to her, I had his stubborn streak, his unrealistic expectations, his selfish nature. Never mind that I barely remembered him being any of those things. Never mind that my memories of him were of bedtime stories and patient help with homework and the way he used to call me his little star. In her version of history, he was just another disappointment, and I was destined to follow in his footsteps. The scholarship letter crumpled slightly in my grip as I fought the urge to defend him, knowing it would only make things worse. "I'm not leaving you with anything," I said, trying to keep my voice steady even as my heart hammered against my ribs. "I'm trying to build a future. I'm trying to make something of myself." But even as I spoke, I could hear how pathetic I sounded, how desperate. Why was I still trying to explain myself to her? Why did I keep hoping that someday, somehow, she would look at me with pride instead of resentment? The kitchen felt smaller suddenly, the walls closing in as her anger filled every available space. I could feel Patrick somewhere in the house, probably listening from the basement stairs, but he would never intervene. He had learned long ago to stay out of her way when she was like this. That's when she said it, the words that would echo in my head for weeks to come. "You're just dead weight, Stephanie. Dead weight that I've been carrying around for 22 years, and I'm tired of it." Her voice was cold now, matter of fact, like she was discussing the weather or what to have for dinner. You want to go to college so bad? Fine. But don't expect to come crawling back here when reality hits you in the face. Don't expect me to be waiting with open arms when you realize you're not as special as you think you are. She turned away from me then, dismissing me like I was nothing, like the conversation was over and my feelings didn't matter enough to warrant another second of her time. I spent the next 3 days walking around like a ghost in my own home, the echo of her words following me everywhere I went. Dead weight. The phrase had lodged itself in my brain like a splinter, working its way deeper every time I tried to forget it. I found myself avoiding the kitchen, taking the long way around the house to get to my room, anything to avoid another confrontation with her. But the damage was already done. Every time I looked in the mirror, I heard her voice telling me I was worthless, unwanted, a burden she had carried for too long. The college acceptance letter sat on my desk, no longer a symbol of hope, but a reminder of how alone I truly was in this world. Patrick found me crying in the backyard on the 3rd night, sitting on the old swing set that Dad had built when we were kids. The chains creaked under my weight as I rocked back and forth, staring up at the stars and wondering if this was what my life would always be like. She didn't mean it, he said quietly, settling onto the swing next to mine. But we both knew that wasn't true. She had meant every word, and probably more that she hadn't said. Patrick was trying to be kind, but he was also trying to convince himself that our mother wasn't as cruel as we both knew she was. At 19, he still held on to the hope that family meant something, that blood was thicker than water, that love would eventually win out over resentment. She's been like this since Dad died, I whispered, my voice hoarse from crying. Maybe even before that. I just don't remember. Patrick was quiet for a long moment, and I could feel him struggling with his own memories, his own pain. He had been 12 when Dad passed, old enough to remember, but young enough to idealize. In his mind, our family had been perfect before the cancer took our father away, but I remembered the fights, the tension, the way Mom would look at Dad sometimes like he had disappointed her in some fundamental way. The same look she gave me now, every single day. Death hadn't created her bitterness. It had just given her a target she couldn't fight back. The worst part was how normal it had all become. Living with her constant criticism, her casual cruelty, her ability to make me feel small with just a look or a sigh. I had friends at school whose mothers hugged them, who celebrated their achievements, who worried about their happiness. But I had learned not to talk about my home life, not to invite people over, not to expect the kind of maternal love that seemed to come so naturally to other families. Instead, I had thrown myself into my studies, into extracurricular activities, into anything that would keep me away from home and give me a sense of worth that I couldn't find within these walls. The scholarship was supposed to be my escape, my proof that I was more than what she said I was. "You should go," Patrick said suddenly, his voice barely audible over the sound of crickets in the grass. "To college, I mean. You should take the scholarship and go." I turned to look at him, surprised by the firmness in his tone. He was staring straight ahead, his jaw set in a way that reminded me painfully of our father. "She's never going to change, Steph. She's never going to see you the way you deserve to be seen. But that doesn't mean you have to stay here and let her convince you that you're not worth anything." His words hit me like a revelation, not because they were new, but because hearing them from him made them feel real, possible, like something I could actually do. But leaving felt like giving up, like admitting defeat. If I walked away now, wouldn't that prove she was right about me? Wouldn't that make me the selfish, ungrateful daughter she had always said I was? The guilt was overwhelming, a heavy weight in my chest that made it hard to breathe. She was my mother, the only parent I had left, and despite everything, some part of me still hoped that someday she would look at me with love instead of resentment. Some part of me still believed that if I just tried hard enough, if I was good enough, if I proved myself worthy enough, she would finally see me as her daughter instead of her burden. The little girl in me, who had once climbed into her lap for bedtime stories, refused to give up on that dream. The next morning, I made my decision. I would accept the scholarship, but I would also try one more time to bridge the gap between us. I found her in the living room, drinking coffee and watching the morning news, her face set in its usual expression of mild irritation with the world. "Mom," I said, settling onto the edge of the couch, "I want to talk about yesterday." She didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge that I had spoken, but I pressed on anyway. "I know you're worried about me leaving, about what will happen to the family, but this scholarship is a good thing. It's an opportunity for me to build a better life, maybe even help you and Patrick someday." My voice was steady, reasonable, the tone I had practiced in my head a dozen times. She finally turned to look at me, and for a moment I thought I saw something softer in her eyes, something that might have been regret or even love. But then her expression hardened again, and I knew I had been fooling myself. "Help us," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You can't even help yourself, Stephanie. You live in a fantasy world where everything is going to work out perfectly, where you're going to be some kind of success story. But real life doesn't work that way. Real life is about responsibility, about taking care of the people who took care of you, and all you want to do is run away." The coffee mug trembled slightly in her hands, and I realized that beneath her anger, she was afraid. Afraid of being alone, afraid of losing control, afraid of facing her own failures without someone to blame them on. 2 weeks passed in a tense standoff, with neither of us willing to back down from our positions. I had sent in my acceptance letter despite her objections, and she had responded by treating me like I was already gone, like I was a stranger living in her house temporarily. She stopped cooking for me, stopped doing my laundry, stopped acknowledging my presence unless absolutely necessary. It was her way of showing me what life would be like without her, what I was supposedly throwing away by choosing my education over my family. But instead of making me reconsider, her cold treatment only reinforced my decision. If this was her love, if this was what I was supposed to be grateful for, then maybe I was better off without it. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the sound of Patrick trying to mediate between us with awkward jokes and forced conversation. He was caught in the middle, torn between loyalty to our mother and his genuine happiness for my success. I could see the stress wearing on him, the way his shoulders sagged when he walked into a room where both of us were present, the careful way he chose his words to avoid setting either of us off. It wasn't fair to him, this war between his mother and sister, but I didn't know how to fix it without sacrificing my own future. The guilt was eating me alive, but so was the knowledge that staying would slowly kill whatever was left of my spirit. Then came the phone call that changed everything. I was in my room, packing the few belongings I planned to take to college, when Patrick knocked on my door. "Steph," he said, his voice strange and tight, "there's someone on the phone for you. Says he's a lawyer." My heart immediately jumped to the worst possible conclusions. Had something happened to one of my friends? Had I somehow gotten in legal trouble without knowing it? I followed him downstairs, my mind racing through possibilities, none of them good. Mom was standing in the kitchen, her face pale and confused, holding the cordless phone like it might bite her. She handed it to me without a word, her eyes searching my face for answers I didn't have. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The man on the other end introduced himself as Mr. Harrison, a lawyer from downtown Beaumont who had been handling my grandfather's estate. My grandfather, Dad's father, had died when I was 10, and I barely remembered him except for the way he used to slip me candy when Mom wasn't looking and the stories he told about his time in the Navy. "Miss Stephanie," Mr. Harrison said, his voice kind but professional, "I need you to come to my office as soon as possible. There are some documents regarding your grandfather's will that require your immediate attention. It's quite urgent, and I'm afraid I can't discuss the details over the phone." The formal tone of his voice made my stomach clench with anxiety. I agreed to meet him the next day, though I had no idea what my grandfather's will could possibly have to do with me 12 years after his death. Mom was hovering nearby, trying to look disinterested, but clearly dying to know what the call was about. When I hung up, she immediately started firing questions at me. What did he want? What documents? Why didn't he call me instead? Her voice had a sharp edge to it, the same tone she used when she suspected Patrick and me of hiding something from her. I told her what little I knew, watching as her expression shifted from confusion to something that looked almost like fear. It was the first time in weeks that she had looked at me like I was a real person instead of an inconvenience. The lawyer's office was in one of the older buildings downtown, the kind with high ceilings and dark wood paneling that made everything feel serious and important. Mr. Harrison was a small, neat man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and he greeted me with the sort of gentle professionalism that immediately put me at ease. "Please, sit down, Miss Stephanie," he said, gesturing to a leather chair across from his massive desk. "I have some rather surprising news for you." He opened a thick file folder and pulled out several official-looking documents, his movements careful and deliberate. The afternoon sunlight streaming through his office windows made the papers glow like they contained secrets, which, as it turned out, they did. "Your grandfather, Robert Mitchell, was a very careful man," Mr. Harrison began, adjusting his glasses as he looked down at the documents. "When he wrote his will, he included several provisions that were not to be executed until specific conditions were met. One of those conditions was your 22nd birthday, which I understand you celebrated last month." I nodded, still confused about where this was going. My 22nd birthday had been a quiet affair. Mom had forgotten entirely, and Patrick had given me a card he'd clearly bought at the last minute. The idea that my grandfather had been planning something for that day, 12 years after his death, seemed impossible. But Mr. Harrison's serious expression told me this was very real. "Miss Stephanie," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "your grandfather left you the family house. The deed is in your name, effective immediately. You are now the sole owner of the property at 1247 Magnolia Street." The words hit me like a physical blow, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. The family house, the house where I had grown up, where my mother and Patrick and I still lived, where every memory of my father was embedded in the walls and floorboards. My grandfather had left it to me, not to my mother, not to be split between his surviving family members, but to me alone. The papers in Mr. Harrison's hands suddenly felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds, like they contained the power to change everything I thought I knew about my life and my place in the world. The drive home from the lawyer's office felt like an out-of-body experience, like I was watching someone else's life unfold from a great distance. The deed to the house sat in my purse like a live grenade, and I kept glancing at it at red lights, half convinced I had imagined the whole thing. But there it was, official and legal and undeniable. My name printed in black ink as the sole owner of 1247 Magnolia Street. The house where my mother had spent the last 12 years telling me I was unwanted, where she had made me feel like a guest who had overstayed her welcome, was actually mine. The irony was so sharp it almost made me laugh, except that I was too stunned to find anything funny about the situation. I sat in the driveway for 20 minutes, trying to figure out how to walk into that house and tell my mother that everything had changed. How do you tell the woman who raised you, who fed you and clothed you and put a roof over your head, that the roof was never actually hers to provide? How do you explain that the grandfather she had always resented, the man she blamed for filling my father's head with unrealistic dreams, had been planning this moment for over a decade? Mr. Harrison had explained that Grandpa Robert had been worried about my mother's treatment of me even when I was young, that he had seen something in her behavior that concerned him enough to take legal action. The thought that someone had been looking out for me all these years, even from beyond the grave, made my chest tight with emotions I couldn't name. When I finally worked up the courage to go inside, I found Mom and Patrick in the living room, both of them looking at me with expectant faces. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, and I could tell they had been discussing my mysterious lawyer meeting while I was gone. "Well," Mom said, her voice sharp with impatience, "what was that all about? What did he want?" I pulled the deed out of my purse with trembling hands, the paper rustling loudly in the sudden silence. Patrick leaned forward in his chair, his eyes wide with curiosity, while Mom's expression grew more suspicious by the second. I had rehearsed this moment during the drive home, but now that I was here, all my carefully planned words seemed to evaporate. "Grandpa Robert left me the house," I said simply, holding out the deed like it was evidence in a court case. "This house, it's mine now." The words hung in the air between us, and I watched as understanding dawned on their faces. Patrick's mouth fell open in shock, while Mom's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and then something that looked like pure rage. She snatched the deed from my hands, her eyes scanning the legal language with increasing fury. "This is impossible," she whispered, but her voice was growing louder with each word. "This house has been in my name for 12 years. I've been paying the mortgage, the taxes, the insurance. This has to be some kind of mistake." But it wasn't a mistake, and we all knew it. Mr. Harrison had explained everything to me in careful detail. How my grandfather had continued to pay the mortgage secretly through a trust fund, how the taxes and insurance had been handled by his estate, how my mother had been living in a house that was never legally hers. She had been making payments to a bank account that fed directly back to the trust, thinking she was building equity in a home that had already been designated as mine. The elaborate deception had been designed to protect me, to ensure that no matter what happened, I would always have a place to call home. But looking at my mother's face, I realized that this gift came with a price I hadn't considered. "You knew," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You knew about this, didn't you? That's why you've been so defiant lately, so sure of yourself. You knew you had this to fall back on." The accusation hit me like a slap, and I felt my own anger rising to match hers. How could she think I would keep something like this secret? How could she believe I was capable of that kind of manipulation? "I had no idea," I said, my voice shaking with emotion. "I found out 20 minutes ago, just like you did. I'm just as shocked as you are." But I could see in her eyes that she didn't believe me, that in her mind, this was just another example of my selfishness, another way I had betrayed her trust. Patrick was staring at both of us like we were speaking a foreign language, his face pale with the realization of what this meant for our family. "So what happens now?" he asked quietly, his voice barely audible over the sound of Mom's heavy breathing. It was a good question, one I hadn't had time to consider fully. Legally, I could ask them to leave. I could change the locks, put the house on the market, start fresh somewhere else. But the thought of making my own family homeless, of destroying what little stability Patrick had left, made me feel sick to my stomach. This house might be mine on paper, but it was still their home, still the place where we had all grieved our father and tried to rebuild our lives from the pieces he left behind. "Nothing has to change," I said, though even as I spoke the words, I knew they weren't true. Everything had already changed, irrevocably and completely. The power dynamic that had defined our family for years had shifted in an instant, and there was no going back to the way things were. Mom was no longer the authority figure who could threaten to kick me out, and I was no longer the dependent child who had to accept her abuse in exchange for shelter. We were equals now, or maybe I was even the one with the upper hand, and none of us knew how to navigate this new reality. The deed felt heavy in my hands, weighted with responsibility and possibility, and the terrifying freedom to choose my own path forward. The next few weeks unfolded like a strange dream, where I was both the protagonist and the observer of my own life. Mom barely spoke to me, moving through the house like a ghost, haunted by her own bitterness, while Patrick tried desperately to maintain some semblance of normalcy between us. I found myself walking through rooms that had always felt like hers, touching walls and door frames with the knowledge that they belonged to me now, that every memory embedded in these spaces was mine to keep or change as I saw fit. The power was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Some nights, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering what my grandfather had seen in me that made him believe I deserved this gift, this responsibility, this chance to rewrite the story of our family. Other nights, I wondered if he had simply been trying to protect me from a future he could already see coming, where my mother's resentment would eventually consume whatever love might have existed between us. The college acceptance letter took on new meaning now, transforming from an escape route into a choice I could make freely. I didn't have to leave home to find independence. I already had it, written in legal documents and sealed with my grandfather's love. But staying felt complicated too, loaded with the weight of my mother's anger and the knowledge that our relationship might never recover from this revelation. I spent hours walking through the house, remembering my father in every corner, hearing his voice in the creaking floorboards, and feeling his presence in the way the afternoon light fell across the kitchen table. This house held our entire history, the good and the bad, and now it was mine to preserve or transform. The responsibility felt enormous, like I was holding not just a deed, but the future of our family in my hands, and I wasn't sure I was strong enough to carry that weight. One evening, as I sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Mom finally approached me. She looked older somehow, worn down by weeks of anger, and the slow realization that her world had shifted beneath her feet. "I need to know," she said, settling into the chair beside me with careful movements, like she was afraid I might ask her to leave. "What are you planning to do? Are you going to sell the house? Are you going to kick us out?" Her voice was quiet, vulnerable in a way I hadn't heard since Dad's funeral, and for a moment I saw past her anger to the fear underneath. "I'm not going to kick you out, Mom," I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "This is your home too. It's Patrick's home. It's where Dad lived and loved us, and I'm not going to destroy that." I could see her shoulders relax slightly, some of the tension leaving her body as my words sank in. "However, things are going to be different now. I'm not going to accept being treated like I'm worthless, like I'm a burden you're forced to carry." The words felt powerful as they left my mouth, like I was finally claiming space that had always been mine, but that I had never felt brave enough to occupy.